Shalom Aleichem. Happy Passover. Happy Pesach. I've been asked to do a couple of short videos on some topics that might be applicable for these times in which we live. The first one we'd like to deal with is, I guess, entitled When We Come Back to Normal. And then the byline under that is, well, whose normalcy? So this is interesting to compare the times in which we live now with what was going on with the Hebrews who lived in Goshen at the time of the 10 plagues being visited upon the Egyptians. And what's really interesting is they were hunkered down in Goshen. And are we hunkered down? But because of this plague? What's also interesting to compare is that this has been a time where a lot of people, because of the isolation, they have some decisions to make about whether to feed their flesh, watch movies, order pizza, do all the stuff to protect themselves from the virus. But I think God would ask us, what are you doing about getting a different type of relationship, closer, more intimate with me? What are you doing to take advantage of this? Are you getting into the Word? Are you spending more time with me in prayer, praising me? Whatever. Are you dedicating yourself to the deliverer of Israel? Well, a lot of the tone of the prayers that are going up to God right now is deliver us. And isn't that interesting? It's almost the same sort of things that the Hebrews, in all probability, were praying at that time during the season of the plagues. Well, what I found also interesting was there was an article that Johnny Enlow handed out, and he had some Bible verses, and I'm just going to hold them up to you so you can take a look at them, and I'll keep them up there for a little bit so you can write them down. But we're going to talk about all three of these. And let me see here. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Let me go back a little bit. How is that? Okay. So the first one is Exodus 12:12 about the demonic principalities getting judged. And then Exodus 12:41 about God's divisions or armies that leave when are leaving Egypt when the Hebrews leave. And then the last one is Exodus 19:3. We're going to read that one. We'll read all three. Where the Father says, "Look, I did all this. I saved you on eagle's wings." Notice what he said. He says not to bring you to the promised land, but rather to bring you back to me. So I have Father God in there, and then Abba there. And so it's going to be interesting to examine some of these principles. So what did Egypt represent as far as a culture, a society, a religion to the Hebrews in Goshen? Now, they were enslaved. That was their condition. And some of the things that I wrote down was in a comparable situation of, are we enslaved to the culture? And people will say, well, we're not enslaved like the Hebrews, but what type of enslavement are we talking about when you get enslaved to the culture's religions, the culture's philosophies, the culture's values, the culture's addictions? And one of the things that I had listed was when people say, "Oh, we're not enslaved." Take a look at people when you go to a restaurant as to whether they can be without looking at their screens on their cell phones for any length of time when other people are sitting at the table, and how much interaction is there going on between the people sitting at the table? I mean, are there conversations? Are they doing interpersonal relations of any sort? Or is everyone staring at this little screen here, I'll give a sample here, and do we live and die by what happens on these screens? And it's amazing. I watch young people trying to cross crosswalks, and they're not even looking at the traffic. They're just looking at their screens, and they're plugged in with the ears, and they're looking at their screens. And if you take away the screens, would there be some sort of emotional trauma involved? And can people live without that? So here's the question: is that enslavement to the culture? So that's just one example. There are other examples of are we enslaved to, for example, being entertained? In other words, we want instant delivery of everything. We want now streaming video, and we have to be instant gratification, totally entertainment at all times. And I think what the Lord is telling us in this season is to say, look around and compare. Are you similar to the Hebrews living in a foreign culture to which they were enslaved? The Passover is a sign from God that He takes this family relationship that we have with Him as His children very seriously. And anything that competes with God's interest in us is going to rouse the jealousy of our Father. And so He doesn't like it when we spend, 2 minutes or 7 minutes, a day, maybe a day, praying, if that, and not spending any time in the Word. And that basically we're kind of putting Him on the back burner and say, well, we'll try to work you into our schedule, however we do that. He's saying, I am your rescuer from something that afflicts you. And the interesting thing is, a lot of us don't even realize we're afflicted. But we are now starting to become more aware of how enslaved we really are to these devices, to these things that we say, well, they're mechanisms of convenience or, faster service or what have you, for the rationale of excuses that we use. And God's saying, I'm your Father, you're my kids, and this relationship is very, very serious to Him. And I don't think we have that level of seriousness as far as being reciprocal. So, a couple of things. What did the Hebrews get rescued from in Passover? Well, they got rescued from the 10 plagues, and of course the 10th was the most serious, where they were going to celebrate the Passover and do the Passover lamb, the Seder dinner, and they were to take that blood of a lamb without spot or defect and place it on the doorposts of their house, so that when the 10th plague of the angel came over their homes, God would see that blood sprinkled on the doorposts of that home and say, this is a home that belongs to me. And so the firstborn of the Hebrew families in Goshen was not killed that night, unlike what happened with the Egyptian families. All of the firstborn were slain that evening. So it was a real jarring event, traumatic event, where finally Pharaoh changes his mind and says, all right, I'm going to let him go. There was something that Johnny Enlow pointed out, and I want to read this verse to you, and it talks about, let me see here. This is in Exodus 12:12, and I want to read it to you. That was on your list on the board that I had earlier. So listen to this. For that night I will pass through the land of Egypt and kill all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both men and animals. And listen to this, this is where it gets interesting. I will execute judgment against all of the gods of Egypt. I am Adonai. So one of the things that's interesting is that the demonic gods that were operable in the culture of Egypt at the time that enslaved God's people, those demonic ruling entities, gods with a little g, were judged that night. Okay? Their power came down. And they couldn't hold on to God's people anymore. Okay, it wasn't just Pharaoh changing his mind, but they lost their authority and power to hold on God's people any longer. They had to let them go. So the Passover, somebody might say, well, that's a salvation experience. But what I'm interested in is that the Jews oftentimes say they don't focus on the word salvation. They use more the word deliverance. The Hebrew people were delivered from that culture of enslavement. And I'm wondering if God is not telling us, oh, here, I have a question for you, my people. When you go back to normal, when all of this is over, what is your normal? And then follow up with the next question. Is your normal what you were doing prior to this COVID-19? Is that my normal? And that, we have to be honest and say, if that's not, we can't say, well, oh, no, we were on fire and we had fervor and zeal for the Lord and dedicated our lives and our thinking process, and we couldn't just keep our mind off of you because our love was growing so much by the day. If we can't say that, well, that's God's normal. And he's a jealous God, and he's not happy with how this culture is reflecting more and more the depravity and the corruption of the Egyptian culture. I mean, look around. I mean, and start comparing. It's pretty amazing. All right, so the other thing that's interesting is one thing that Johnny Enlow pointed out in Exodus 12:41. I'll read that to you. Notice this. I never had seen this before. This time the people of Israel lived in Egypt 430 years. That was the length of their enslavement. At the end of the 430 years, to the day, isn't that interesting? To the day. Tell me God's not precise when he fulfills Scripture. All of the divisions of Adonai left the land of Egypt. Now, when it says divisions, that is the translation of the Complete Jewish Bible by David Stern. And then notice in the New King James, it's got here, 1241. Listen to it here. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that, listen to this, all of the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. And basically what Johnny Enlow was pointing out was, he said, the protective covering that was over the Jews, not one plague penetrated that community in Goshen within the confines, the territory of Egypt. Not one. When the people left to leave Egypt, and basically by leaving, they're saying we are no longer part of this. We do not belong to this any longer. Our belongingness, our identity belongs with our God, and he's taken us back to himself primarily, and he's also taken us to our inheritance. So the armies, or the divisions, depending on which translation you read, they left with the departure of the Hebrews from Egypt. And one of the things that Johnny Enlow asked is, he says, what happens if you decide that, you know what, I kind of like the Egyptian culture, and now that the plagues have been lifted off, I think I'll go back. I'll return. I felt pretty comfortable over there, and I could make things all balance out, and I didn't do anything crazy or radical as far as this commitment, this God stuff, and I think I'll go back. And Johnny Enlow had a very interesting observation. He said, if you do go back to that culture after God has delivered you from the gods, the demonic powers that ruled Egypt, if you decide to go back on your own, what was there earlier protecting you in Goshen as far as spiritual protection, be it angelic or otherwise, it's not going to be there for you when you do return on your own. And that was pretty sobering to me because I believe that what God is trying to show us is to say, hey, this COVID virus, that was a shot across the bow. It's to wake people up and say, look, I'm getting serious about this. Either you belong to me or you belong to this system. Either you belong to me or you belong to this so-called civilization, as decrepit and depraved as it is. And the question is, to whom do you belong? It's kind of the question that Joshua answers, and in as far as me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua, I believe, it's in Joshua 24. So God's not allowing the gray anymore. It's a separation now into these distinct colors between black and white, and all of these situations, we have to say, wait a minute, why do we have this prototype of experiences with the Hebrews? It's interesting, if you go to 1 Corinthians 10, they said everything that happened to the Hebrews is supposed to serve as examples to us. That's New Testament. Okay? So God hasn't changed. The question is, are we hoping that somehow because of our attachments, our addictions, and our enslavements, we're hoping that God will change his mind and lower his standards? And what Johnny Lenlow is saying is, if you go back to that after the pressures, the plagues are gone, God help you, because what was there before to protect you will not be available. Okay? So that was a heavy duty one.